All right, y'all. Hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your favorite conservatarian, Jeff Charles, where we choose truth over narrative and principles over politics. And I've got another fire guest for you guys today. It's going to be on some pretty important stuff. I mean, I've been talking about it for quite a while, and unfortunately, I can't stop because it's too important. But I'm sure you are familiar with all the stuff going on in schools with the attempted transing of children and oftentimes successful transing of children. Although I guess it can't really be successful because you can't turn a boy into a girl and vice versa. Anyway, before I get to my guest, remember to like this video, share this video, and subscribe. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload a new interview, which I do every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern. Now, without further ado, you already know who she is. She's been on the program before. I have Miss Nicole Neily, president of Parents Defending Education, one of my favorite organizations out there right now. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Good. Now, so for the few people who might not know who you are, just give us a rundown of who you are and what Parents Defending Education is.
Sure. So I have worked kind of in and around the freedom movement for about 15 years at places like Cato and the Independent Women's Forum. I used to run a campus free speech group called Speech First, and now I run a K-12 anti-woke education organization called Parents Defending Education. And we want to give parents both the knowledge and the tools they need to be more engaged in their children's education. Because obviously, parents found out during COVID that schools today are not teaching exactly what we used to teach, and they're concerned, rightfully so, about that, but people don't necessarily know how to engage on that. And so we want to give them the confidence they need to be better advocates on behalf of their children, because as we have learned, the teachers unions, the National School Board Association, the previous gatekeepers that we thought had our children's best interest at heart, absolutely do not.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's interesting that this whole issue of parents' rights came up. And the thing is, I would never have expected this. And a lot of parents don't really know what their rights are because they didn't have to. They were already being respected, at least back in the day they were. But nowadays, parents do have to know what their rights are because these school districts are not trying to hear any of that, right?
Absolutely. And it's funny because when you think about rights in education, we generally think about it in a higher ed setting. So you can think about campus free speech. You think about Leah Thomas as a swimmer. You think about kangaroo courts in Title IX. But you don't think about, can my fourth grader be forced to use somebody's pronoun, or who can be in an overnight field trip with my daughter on when they go on a band trip. And so parents have questions about stuff like that. And once they know where those red lines are, then they know if and when those red lines are crossed, something has to happen. And so we just want to give them that confidence to be able to speak up and speak out.
Now, I seem to remember, didn't Parents Defending Education create a sort of guide for parents who aren't sure? Yeah. Can you tell them a little bit about that, just for parents who might be concerned?
Yeah, we have a bunch of different guides on all these different rights. What is Title VI? What is Title IX? What is the First Amendment? I send my kid to a private school. What are my rights there? Because it's confusing for a lot of people. And so I think of what we do almost as translating lawyer into English, just breaking it down very straightforward. And so people know what is and what is not okay. Because unfortunately, we see school administrators all the time trying to confuse people with jargon and speaking down to them. And, we figure, nobody has time for that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a perfect resource, especially for those who are not fluent in legalese, which is most of us. So, yeah. So I wanted to first talk about this new policy that Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin put into place that focuses on parental rights, and it also addresses the transgender issue. Why don't you kind of give us kind of an overview of what they've done?
Sure. So this was introduced on Friday by the Youngkin administration. It had been several months in the making, but it revised the previous guidance put out by the North administration, but starting from a place of parental rights. Parents deserve to know what is going on in their children's lives. And while that might seem like common sense to you and me, unfortunately, more often than not, we're seeing districts around the country that are not respecting that, where the default setting to those administrators is parents are unsafe. The only ones you can trust are us in the school. So putting ideas into kids' heads that, if you were to come out to mom and dad as gay, as transgender, they might not be welcoming of you. And unfortunately, most kids don't think like that until an adult actually puts that idea in their head. And so it really starts to throw up a wall between a parent and a child, which is deeply concerning because obviously when a student graduates at 18, that superintendent, that math teacher is not going to be there. Mom and dad will. And at that point, that relationship and that trust has been irreparably destroyed. And so the Youngkin administration, starting from a place of parental rights should be respected, and schools are not going to interfere in that, is really, it's revolutionary, but it's sad that it has to be revolutionary in 2022.
Yeah, these policies shouldn't even be needed. They should just be by default. But I want to touch on something that you just said, as far as, parents, essentially branding parents as the enemy. Why do you think they're doing that? I mean, do they really think that most parents are the enemy of their children, or like, well, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's really sad. It's really troubling, because let's remember, at the end of the day, schools are already mandatory reporters. If you think that if a teacher or an administrator thinks that a child is in danger, they are required by the state to notify them about this. And so to use children as a political pawn, when it comes to issues like this, it's something that's really concerning, because that's not what it is. Certainly there are bad parents out there, and we don't want children to be in unsafe situations, but those mechanisms already exist. And so again, to flip the script from, okay, well, like, let's assume parents are good and have a child's best interest at heart, to let's assume that the parent is bad, it's like through the looking glass. It's kind of mind-boggling. And so when districts start to write policies from that standpoint, we see things happening like in Linn-Mar, Iowa, where Parents Defending Education has a lawsuit where they explicitly frame out that beginning in 7th grade on, a child's gender preference takes precedent over the family, and the parents don't need to be notified at all. And so districts around the country, I mean, honestly, from coast to coast, are encouraging students to live a double life. A child can be one gender at home, another one at school. Some schools have clothing closets where a student can come to school and change into a whole new outfit and assume a whole new identity. And so, let's think about this increased emphasis that schools have on mental health right now. What does that kind of thing do to a child's mental health? If they know that they're keeping such a significant secret from their family, that has to have devastating repercussions, but schools are not factoring that into account.
Well, and also, casting their parents as the villain is going to create mental health issues too. I mean, the whole thing over the parental rights and education bill, I had people saying, well, some children are abused. And I'm sure that they're using that same argument with this new policy in Virginia. But my thing is, like, first off, that's a dishonest argument, because the vast majority of parents do not abuse their kids. And all 50 states already have mechanisms in place if that's happened. Like you said, like, the teachers are mandated reporters. If they have evidence, or they have a good reason to think that there's abuse going on, then they can kick it up. And I've talked to teachers in Florida and in other states about this too. And yeah, they said the same thing. So that, as we say in Texas, that dog won't hunt. But what really boils my blood is, like you said, the casting of the parent as the enemy. Like, it's almost like they're using it to justify their indoctrination of the children. It's really part and parcel of how the far left really does think that kids should belong to the state and not to the parents. And now they've got this antagonistic relationship between school districts, teachers, and the parents that didn't seem to exist before, unless I'm missing something.
No, and I think back to when I was in school. Maybe I got in trouble once or twice, right? And the school would call your parent, and the parent would come in and they'd meet with the teacher or the principal, and they'd figure out, all right, how do we put Nikki, how do we put Jeff, on a path, to get them back on track. Mm-hmm. And instead now it's very adversarial. It's deliberately trying to undermine that family authority. And it's judging families on things like, are you religious? Are you, what are your politics? And so the school's making assumptions about how you may or may not act or respond to your child. When, again, as you said, the vast majority of families are loving, are supportive, want to do right by their child. Certainly, do those exceptions exist? Absolutely. But safeguards are in place. And so we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, undermining 99% of parents because 1% of parents are bad.
Right. And I should kind of clarify what I said, because I wasn't quite right. I'm sure if the parents were along with the agenda, they wouldn't be cast as enemies, right?
Exactly.
So do you see, in Florida, you've got the parental rights and education. Now we have this policy in Virginia. Do you see other states adopting these types of measures too, or are they kind of slow rolling it, or how do you see this playing out nationally?
Yeah, I think we're going to start to see a lot of movement in state legislative sessions. This obviously was driven by Governor Youngkin's administration, Governor DeSantis in Florida. But I think it's really, we have seen different levers being exercised by state attorneys general that have sued the Biden administration over the weaponization of Title IX, because the Biden administration told schools, if you receive money for Title I for food stamps, for poor kids, if you don't respect Title IX as we define it, then they were literally pulling money out of the mouths of poor kids. We've seen a ton of states pass bills protecting female athletes in sports, and so there is a forthcoming showdown between the states and the federal government about this, because in the Biden administration's proposed Title IX rewrite, they explicitly say that their federal wishes take supplant whatever the states are doing, and so there is going to be a big fight, and it's going to have to be resolved by the Supreme Court, I think.
Wow. Yeah. So can you kind of dig into Title IX and and how exactly the Biden administration is rewriting this?
Sure. So in 2018, Secretary DeVos in the Trump administration codified or put out proposed rules to change and put more guardrails into Title IX. Title IX is a law that was written in 1972 to prevent, it's short, it's 37 words, to prevent discrimination on the basis of sex in education. Very straightforward. Jeff, when you and I grew up, we probably thought about it mostly in the sporting context. I remember hearing about colleges getting rid of maybe a men's wrestling team because there wasn't a women's wrestling team. And so the idea was that there should be parity in a lot of things. Mm-hmm. During the Obama years, that kind of took on a whole new life of itself, because the definition of discrimination on the basis of sex was expanded into things like telling jokes. And so really encouraging students or schools to trample on students' First Amendment rights, sacrificing the First Amendment on the altar of Title IX. And this wasn't done through a proper regulatory process. It was done through something called notice and comment, or through something called a Dear Colleague letter. So it was sort of just a wink, wink, like, be a real shame if you lost all your federal funding, but they didn't go through the whole proper process. Secretary DeVos did. She put in place guardrails. And when the federal government wants to actually do that, they have to put out their proposed rule, open it up for comments from the public. And Secretary DeVos received about 124,000 comments from that process. It took them 18 months to go through it. The final rule was released in May of 2020. So really radically revamped a lot of this, put really much more stringent guardrails on what the federal government could or couldn't do. This past July 12th, the Biden administration proposed their rewrite of that. So they want to roll back a lot of what Secretary DeVos had done. But in addition to rolling back the due process protections, the First Amendment protections, what they also want to do is overlay sexual orientation and gender identity into the statute, into the meaning of the word sex. So this would follow the Supreme Court's Bostock ruling from a couple years ago. Unfortunately, Bostock was Title VII, done through 1964 through the Civil Rights Amendments. Title IX is something that's very different. And so the fact that this is happening right now, again, not through the proper procedure, because if you want to so radically change a statute like that, it has to be done through Congress. Like, you are actually reading a new definition into this term, or into the whole statute. That has to be done through Congress. It can't just be done through this whole regulatory process. But we submitted our formal comments through this process. It was open for 60 days. And we at Parents Defending Education helped about 33,000 people submit their comments in opposition to this new rule. Nice. Parents had concerns on a number of levels, on fairness levels, on safety issues, on parental rights issues. And this is not even really in the higher ed context. It's really just in the K-12 setting. But the fact that this would so radically remake the American educational system was something that was of deep concern to a lot of people. And so I think at last count, there were about 235,000 comments that were submitted about this rule, which blows the DeVos numbers out of the water, and really shows that people feel very strongly about this. And so it'll be really interesting to see how the Biden administration incorporates those or doesn't.
So are there revisions mainly centered on transgender or LGBTQ, or are there other significant elements of it too, or?
Yes, there are significant elements across the board. It's about a 700-page rule, which is kind of staggering in and of itself, right? That's so federal government. So it rolls back due process protections for students that are accused of crimes. I mean, the DeVos rule put into place things like you have access to exculpatory evidence, like things that we would all want. Right. Cross-examination, where if you are accused of something, you should be able to actually ask questions and prove that maybe your accuser made things up. So things like that have been taken out of the rule. The First Amendment protections that were put in place, where harassment has to be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it interferes with an educational opportunity. Those are out the window. It only has to fulfill one of those things. They changed the word and to or, which like really kind of radically remakes the interpretation of that sentence. But then also all of these transgender issues, definitely being overlaid on top of that, means that, you know, there are things like locker rooms, bathrooms, overnight field trips where parents have no idea what's going on and they have concerns over these things. And unfortunately, when parents raise those concerns about the privacy of girl-only spaces, about the safety of their daughters when they play sports, I think about how a female lacrosse player throws a ball at 45 to 65 miles an hour and doesn't wear a chest protector or a helmet. Male lacrosse players throw a ball 85 to 95 miles an hour and they wear both a chest protector and a helmet. So if you have a biological male playing against a female, you could kill her. I mean, there are real legitimate safety concerns. We saw the assault that happened in Loudoun County last year. Yeah. That was after a transgender bathroom policy was passed. And so anybody could go into any bathroom at any time based on what they said they were at the time. So there are those kinds of safety concerns. And there are also, there are fairness concerns. The fact that many female athletes have spent thousands of hours throughout the course of their lives training, going to practices, trying to earn a scholarship or a place on a podium. And they're not able to do that now if they're competing against biological males. Parents want to know about these things. They want to make informed choices about whether their daughter plays in a sporting team or if maybe she goes on a field trip or not.
Right.
And parents are being denied that opportunity and cut out of that process. And so there are many problems with this rule. And so I think that, that's another reason that we have seen so many thousands of comments submitted is that people are deeply worried and they really want to make their voices heard.
So here's my question, and I always say this, but I know you can't read minds. But under Betsy DeVos, the way they revised Title IX, it seemed like a lot of common sense type stuff. I'm sure if I read the whole thing, there might be things that I disagree with or whatever. But in general, it seems to be common sense type stuff. With this rewrite, what do you think the Biden administration is trying to accomplish? Like, what is the ultimate objective with this?
I think there is kind of equity above all, right? So it's sort of bringing things down to the lowest common denominator. And we've seen this in the racial setting. We're seeing this in the sex setting. There is a whole strain of thought where gender is just a social construct, and so the idea of female-only spaces is discriminatory, is exclusionary. But when we sued this district in Iowa in Linn-Mar, the default setting was that girls have to be okay with boys in the bathroom. And if they're not, then they have to be the weird ones who go off to the nurse's office to go use the bathroom by themselves. Again, it's anybody who's not okay with it, they're the ones who are marginalized. And so you have the vast majority. I talked to a bunch of families who said their daughters just simply didn't change for gym for the last 6 weeks of the school year. They didn't go to the bathroom at school, drink water for the last 6 weeks of the school year. And so that's where things have sort of gone to. And so it feels very much like it's through the looking glass almost, where, and certainly, we don't want children who have gender dysphoria or, have gender identity issues to feel marginalized. But we're also bullying students who are not fully okay with that. Students who choose to not use a classmate's preferred pronoun, either because they can't remember it, maybe they don't believe in it, have, their own views on the subject, they're the ones who are being targeted and, being disciplined for bullying and subject to punishment up to and including expulsion or suspension.
God, that's ridiculous. Like, this is clown world. Like, so you said this will probably go to the Supreme Court, and I agree. But do you think it'll get to the Supreme Court before 2024? Because it could also just be eliminated if Republicans win in 2024. Which do you think might happen first? Right.
Well, I think it'll take them at least 18 months to go through these 235,000 comments. And so it'll probably come out, spring, summer of 2024. I imagine that there will be litigation immediately. After Secretary DeVos's rules came out in May 2020, there were 4 lawsuits that were filed immediately by activists. And so I expect the same thing will happen. But as you said, there is the possibility that if a Republican administration comes in, they'll rescind it. There is something called the Congressional Review Act, where depending on how late in a term something happens, it can be undone by an act of Congress. And so I think there are a couple tools at people's disposal. And, one of which is the Administrative Procedure Act that, did the government, because, quite honestly, I don't have a super high opinion of how this process will unfold. Even if all 235,000 comments raise valid procedural concerns, legal concerns, my gut is that this Department of Education is going to proceed full steam no matter what. And so if they do that, then the Administrative Procedure Act can be used to challenge the law on the grounds that it is arbitrary and capricious, that the government has just acted, they've done whatever they want, regardless of the facts. And I think, that's something that's likely to happen as well. But if there is another Biden administration or a President Kamala Harris administration, it's going to be much harder to undo those things. And so just another reminder for people that elections matter.
Yeah, they do. And that actually leads me to my the last question. Let's say Republicans by 2024, let's say by 2024, they have the House, the Senate, and the White House. Can they, and I'm sure at that point, they'll rewrite the Title IX again to, have some actual common sense. Can they enshrine that into law? I mean, do you think that'll be on their radar? Or because if not, then next time a Democrat is in the White House,
back and forth every administration. Yeah, it's really troubling, it's confusing, and very rarely do I feel bad for school administrators, but for policies to change so radically every 4 years is confusing and problematic in and of itself. Funny enough, I think back to 2020, it was the height of COVID. 100% of schools in America were closed that summer, and schools, for the most part, didn't even go back into session that fall. And we saw Title IX administrators from across the country at universities throw up their hands and say, there's no way we can implement this in time because, it's only 10 weeks away. Again, forgetting the fact that they had 18 months, they sort of saw the writing on the wall and knew where the policies were going. But there were 0 students on campus anywhere, higher ed, K-12, anywhere that summer. And they were not able to comply with it. What we're seeing now is our districts and universities across the country that are already preemptively changing their rules, their Title IX rules, to comply with what they think the rule might end up being in 2024, while ignoring what the law actually currently says, which is something that is really kind of mind-boggling, but it shows you where a lot of these bureaucrats' heads and hearts are at anyway. And so, if there is an argument for shrinking the government, that's it, right? It's like the next closest thing to eternal life is a government program. These are people who are entrenched, and this is what they believe in. And so we should want fewer people out there with those jobs, period.
Yeah, definitely. So before we sign off, why don't you let us know what else Parents Defending Education has on the docket for right now?
Sure. We have, now that school's back in session, our tip line is back in full effect. Since our launch last March, we've been receiving 50 to 200 tips a week from across the country.
You got to be
Last year, a lot of it was about race. This year, a lot of the tips are about gender, about things like health pronouns. It's crazy. But also, we're seeing a lot of parents that are deeply concerned about surveys that their children are being asked, first week of school, what are your pronouns? Cannot tell your parents. And so it raises questions for parents. Who is collecting this information? Where are you storing it? What are you doing with it? Because on average, 2 school districts a day in America are hacked. That's a really staggering number.
Wow.
And so, and parents want to know what kinds of questions their kids are being asked, because, for me, it raises questions of, how will this information be used against me in the future? If my son goes to school and he's mad at me because I didn't give him an extra waffle this morning, and he writes down, I hate mommy, right? Is that going to be used against me at some point, as a building block that I have an unsafe household? And so I think, this increasing kind of role of big tech in our children's education is something that we're hearing a lot about these days from our parents. And so it's something else that we're starting to look into a lot more.
Well, maybe you should make sure you're giving them enough waffles. That might solve a problem.
Blackmail.
So I would expect with all these tips, we're probably going to see a few more lawsuits from PDE.
I think so. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're doing it, though. I've been talking about how lawfare is one of the pillars that we need to fight back on this stuff, and you guys have been at the forefront of that. So, before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Sure. Our website is defendinged.org, and then we're on all the normal social media channels: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So, check us out there too.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining the program, and I look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you so much.